I think the call of Christ at its root is to fear God and no one else. At its root, to fear God and no one else is to take up your cross and follow him, is to lay down your life for your friends. No greater love is man than this. It is to be a recipient of the overwhelming grace of God. And then the invitation is to live a life in the world, in the kingdom of God, though we are in this world. And I think the only way to do that I have found is prayer.
Hi, friends. Welcome back to the Digital Examen podcast. I'm Jay Kim, your host. And as always, I am so grateful that you are joining us on this journey of slowing ourselves down, of noticing the loving presence of God all around us. And in this season of the Digital Examen, we are specifically exploring the possibility of discovering real joy and delight in our lives as we slow down, notice God, learn to listen, and posture ourselves in all of life to live with deeper awareness as we examine all of life at all times and in all moments with God. Recently, just in the last few weeks, actually, as I'm recording this, I've, for a number of reasons, both personal and in ministry and through relationships, I've just honestly had sort of a rough go. It's been, life is obviously full of ups and downs, peaks and valleys, and of course, long, long plateaus of what seems like the ordinary and the mundane. But I can honestly say the last few weeks have been sort of journeys through valleys on an emotional level and on a relational level in some ways. Doubt and sometimes even cynicism have found their way into my head and into my heart. But thankfully, by the grace of God and by the work of His Spirit in my life over many years, I've learned to recognize those things as lies, and often as lies of the enemy. But what's interesting is, honestly, just my personality. I typically default to the life of the mind. One of my great temptations is to analyze and intellectualize away the tension or the problem or whatever it might be. But it's interesting in the last few weeks as I've sort of traversed through this mini valley, one of the things that has been so helpful to me is listening to music. There's a really beautiful thing that happens when melody and harmony and a sort of sonic experience surrounds particular intellectual ideas or knowledge. Specifically, I've been listening to a particular album that journeys us through the narrative of Jesus. And it has been so settling for me. It reminds me that for many years, in my late teenage years and in my early 20s, I actually played a lot of music. I was in a couple of extraordinarily mediocre local bands, and we would, all hop into this dingy little van and tour around California. And I just remember having this deep love and joy creating art together with these dear friends of mine. And I remember the feeling of delight and joy that would come not from the music itself being so spectacular, but from the process of creating something together. And I think that's what good music and great music can do in all of us, whether we make the song or not. I think that's what great art does in all of us, whether we created the art ourselves or not. Great art, great music, great songs have a way of taking ideas and truths that live mostly in our heads, and it helps it make its way into our hearts and through our hearts into our bodies. And in doing so, music and great art has a unique way of reintroducing us to the joy and the delight that is possible if we would just pay attention. So The album I've been listening to these last few weeks on repeat is an album simply titled Jesus. And it's by one of my absolute favorite artists, an artist named Jon Guerra. And Jesus, this album, is one of several albums Jon Guerra has put out. And it's a stunning devotional journey through the Christ narrative. But it's reminded me of why I started listening to Jon Guerra in the first place. Jon is a singer and songwriter based in Austin, Texas, and he writes, in his words, devotional music. We're going to dig into that in our conversation today. He also composed the music for the 2019 Terrence Malick film, A Hidden Life, and he is an incredibly gifted singer-songwriter, but an even more beautiful soul, committed to Christ and creating beauty in Jesus' name to help all of us discover joy and delight. And so, without further ado, here is my conversation with Jon Guerra. Jon, thank you so much for joining us on the Digital Examen podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me, Jay.
Yeah, I want to jump right into it. One of the reasons why, one, I just fell in love with your music early on a number of years ago. And two, one of the reasons why we really, really wanted to have you for a conversation on the Digital Examen is, well, lots of reasons, but one of the reasons is the really beautiful way you describe the music that you create. You call it devotional music, but then you have this descriptor that I just find so compelling. It's less Sunday morning worship music and more Monday morning prayer music, a collaboration with quiet music for attending to the soul and for listening to God. So I want to start by asking you, tell us a little bit about where this approach to songwriting came from. Did you, for most of us who don't maybe know the backstory of how you got to where you are, did you start out writing music like this, or did you sort of,
Yeah.
find your way here somehow?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I did not start out writing music like this. I grew up as a worship leader, as a kid playing in church, and still very much love congregational singing, believe in it, but found as I got older and as not only as a creative songwriter, but as a Christian, found that the emotional timbre of modern worship music, Christian music, felt increasingly narrow to me, such that it didn't include the wide scope of what it means to be a follower of Jesus in 2025 and all the emotions that we experience between Monday and Sunday. When I was in college, I went to a school called Moody Bible Institute and I studied historical theology. And I remember taking a class on the Psalms, and this guy, Walter Brueggemann, who passed away actually recently this year, he describes the Psalms in this way. He says it's a collection of Godward humanity. There is no question, there's no feeling, there's no doubt, there's no excitement that isn't represented in the Psalms. And he says, and what that teaches us is there's no version of you that can't be directed towards God in prayer. And I sort of take that as permission and a model for my writing, trying to bear witness to the various and sundry gestures of faith, postures of faith, seasons of faith in my songs so that people can funnel their own humanity through them. And I started doing that about 5-6 years ago, put out a record called Keeper of Days, and that was the first one of that I did that. And I think additional reason was it was sort of a season too that many of my friends were deconstructing and maybe no longer identifying as Christians or kind of tossing a lot about the faith. And through conversations and just thinking through that, I realized that if your expectations from the faith are solely drawn from some of the emotional and lyrical visions of some of our worship music, if that's all you have, then when you live your life and your life doesn't go that way, your faith doesn't look like a soaring chorus at the end of it, or then you kind of think, what the heck's going on? This is I was sold a bill of goods that was not right. So then you toss it. In some ways, I think I was just talking to my wife about this actually. I think part of it is writing songs for my friends as a way of almost saying, it's okay if it's not a soaring, victorious bridge. There's room for you too. So,
Yeah, that's so good. You know, I want to ask a follow-up question because you sort of you alluded to it a little bit here. I was going to ask it later, but I think it's important to talk about here. Let's just talk about the local church. I'm a pastor in a local church. I love what you said, still believe in congregational singing. And yet there's a lot of resonant frequencies with what you just said, that if all the songs we sing are just these epic soaring choruses of how good God is
yeah,
and how there's victory in our lives or
yeah,
whatever it might be, that's all true. But going back to the Brueggemann quote, there is no human experience or human emotion that we cannot bring to God, that isn't brought to bear. And for me, even just as a pastor, one of the great comforts I find is there is no human emotion or experience that isn't found somewhere in the scriptures. You
that's
talk
right.
about the Psalms, like it's all in there, all of the pain, all of the hurt and heartbreak and agony and the hope and the joy and the delight. So let's talk about the local church a little bit. You still believe in congregational singing. So
Oh,
do
of
I.
course.
But
Yeah.
if you're willing to share, like, if anything, as you sort of assess the landscape of the modern Western evangelical, maybe church, um, what might we be missing with the primarily the types of songs we mostly sing? And then what are we missing because of the types of songs maybe we don't sing as much or at all in most of our local churches?
I'm glad you asked that question for two reasons. I think I just very much believe in the fact that there's good reasons why we sing the songs we sing, right? I think as a worship leader, I relate to the struggle of trying to find new ways of getting people to just respond, right? Getting people to use their literal bodies to sing praises to God. I think that's something that is formational. It's physical, and then it seeps down into our hearts. And that's a really hard thing. And usually the people that are best at writing songs like that are people who are making a living doing it by writing the kinds of songs that also work on Christian radio. That's not bad. That's just recognizing the fact that, well, they're also making their living doing this by writing a mega chorus that works well when you're driving your kids to school or whatever. And usually those kinds of songs are in a particular kind of lane. And I think what we miss when we don't maybe broaden the scope a little bit is we miss, again, parts of the human experience that are as common as sliced bread. We miss possible occasions of contact with God, because I think it's not only that God sees and acknowledges that life is difficult and hard and tragic at times. It's that God is actually there. It's God is literally waiting for you to lament that one thing so that he can be there with you and weep with you and console you. And you can have I remember N.T. Wright said, when Jesus calls Mary's name in the garden after he's resurrected and she recognizes him through her tears, he has this aside. He said, sometimes we can only recognize God through tears. Sometimes we can't see him unless we're trying to see him through tears. And I think that that's been so true through the history of the church. If you read testimonies of people, that God shows up in those places. And so we're missing opportunities of contact with God if we're only focusing on the deliverance, on the resurrection, which is very real. I mean, that's the end of the story. The point is, you can't really get there though unless you go down into the grave first.
Yeah.
And also, I think we're also missing, for worship leaders, and this is maybe a larger conversation, but at a certain age, worship leaders tend to stop being worship leaders or music directors. They either leave ministry and they go to like an adult job or something, or they become a pastor and become like, why is that? And then we hire the 22-year-old, with a great voice, who can sing the songs, who's got the energy to. And I think we're missing out on an entire spectrum of ministers who are formed by the challenge of trying to take congregations through the diverse landscape of human experience, because it's really hard to try to do this. It's really
Yeah.
hard to take a congregation and lament together or grieve together without getting saccharine or without just kind of making it uncomfortable. And I think we just don't like that discomfort. But part of that discomfort, I think, is a forming agent in people, such that I do wonder if there would be
Yeah.
more longevity for people in worship ministry if there wasn't not only permission, but a call to take the entire spectrum of human experience and bring that to bear in a congregation. Because when you get to middle age, you're not, personally, it's not just all like, boom, hands, like you've experienced it. Maybe you've walked with people in your church that have experienced tragedy. Maybe wife has had a miscarriage, like whatever it is. It's like you're kind of, the lines in your eyes are getting thicker for good reason. And I think we miss out on, so for those two reasons, I think the difficulty is part of the medicine, part of the formation. And I think it's also an opportunity to for people to meet God in a way that where they wouldn't expect otherwise.
Yeah, John, what you just said is like so profound. It's convicting in a lot of ways for me, just as a pastor of a local church that is very familiar with, it's just shy of confrontation, but the sort of clarifying, sobering reality you're introducing here, which I think is like, yeah, why is it that it's just always kind of yeah, and I love the young 25-year-old worship leader that's a gifted. That's great.
100%. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, but why is it that we don't have the full breadth? It makes me think of like when Johnny Cash recorded the Nine Inch Nails song, Hurt, and it was like this famous story where Trent Reznor, who wrote the song, is like, "Oh, that's not my song anymore because I wrote the words as a young man." But then this really sort of broken, pained Johnny Cash, who had been through decades of ups and downs, took the words I wrote, but he sang them in such a way that it was basically a new song. And that's how most people know that song, is the Johnny Cash version. And there is a real beauty in that because it feels so human and it feels so real. And it is the full breadth of human experience. So, along those lines, coming back to your music, John, one of the things that, amongst many things that has been so profoundly affective in my life as I listen to your work is that songwriting in general seems like such a vulnerable endeavor, right? It's an exposure of your inner life to the world. And so when I listen to your music, that is certainly there. I was just listening to Citizens this morning. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so honest and so raw. And it's just like courageous to be able to say these things. And at the same time, in your music, what's profound is like, even when the subject matters heavy, I always hear the through lines of delight and joy and possibility. So I would love to know, maybe going to the writing process, like, is there delight that's woven into the process for you? Like, where does that come from, even when the subject matter is heavy?
Oh, absolutely. No, I love writing songs. I love that I get to do this. I started writing songs when I was 12 after kind of an experience with God that I didn't understand. It was through music, and I didn't understand it, but I just kind of kept running towards it with my guitar, with my few chords. And I very much enjoy the process of, and I think other creative people, songwriters, writers, poets, whatever, can relate to that. That there is, like Eric Liddell, Chariots of Fire. When I run, I feel His pleasure. I very much relate to when I write, I feel His pleasure. Even when I'm writing something that is hard and difficult, that's kind of my way of being with God in the difficult, is by writing through it. So in terms of the vulnerability, yeah, I mean, it was probably easier when I was younger, because when you're younger, you kind of wear that on your sleeve as a badge of honor. But now that I'm older and I'm taking my kids to school and I'm like supposed to be this respectable dad, I'm like, I sometimes feel a little bit exposed. You're picking on something that's very real, and something that's also, I think is another reason why I have chosen devotional music as opposed to congregational worship music or Christian music, which are the predominant genres of Christian music right now, is because there's an increased level and a vulnerability that is available to me in devotional music, and that I think is supposed to be there. I think the artists are always supposed to be the ones on the edge of respectability and polite society. Kind of like Dostoevsky's Holy Fool. The Holy Fool in Dostoevsky that was where Christ was in the story. He was the one disrupting whatever was happening, for better, for worse, such that the jostling of the narrative tensions produced some kind of life and produced some kind of possibility for God to enter in. And I think art and artists at best are like a jostling component that God might enter in through some of those cracks. And the tropes are all there. We can go over the top, and it can be kind of like, you've got the caricature of the avant-garde. This is a toilet on the wall with a cross. Whatever it is, it, like, we get it, we know it, it's funny, ha ha ha. But I think there is something there that is a call to be kind of like John the Baptist eating locusts and honey, wearing the camel, coming from the outside, saying, "Hey, there's an axe laid at the root of the tree. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is." Some of us have to just swallow that pill and do that. And so I certainly feel like I'm called to do that at least at this point in my life. I mean, maybe I won't be forever, but I do feel a little bit and take that seriously. I'm not naturally a very combative person. I really am not. I like to keep the peace. I don't like to rock the boat. So when those songs do come and I feel I'm actually supposed to go a little further, I kind of listen to it, because that's not my natural inclination, is to be that way. And I think, I think it's beneficial for the church, for some, and for the artists to be those who kind of jostle us from our comfort a little bit with our vulnerability.
That's a beautiful thought. It's a challenging thought. And, it connects to the next thing I wanted to talk to you about. When I listen to your music, everything you're saying shows up, at least for me, when I listen to the songs. And a part of what I mean by that is that your songs, they are exquisite musically, and the lyrics, and it's clearly a work of, it's clearly very painstaking, a labor of love. And yet they almost never feel like performative. They never feel
Oh,
like
great.
the songs never feel like they are intended, they're designed to elicit a particular reaction or response from me. They feel like a prayer, like a
Yeah,
very
cool.
honest, genuine prayer from someone's life that I now get to
Cool.
sort of listen in on and enjoy. So I wanted to ask you, as a songwriter and as an artist, and maybe there aren't, but are there like specific practices or approaches that have helped you move away from the temptation to sort of perform, and instead to create from a place of prayer?
Yeah, I'm so glad we're going to talk about prayer. That feels very constitutive of what I'm at least trying to do and what my aim is. I would say the biggest influence that I would have in terms of not trying to force people to feel things is, my wife and I were privileged to work with a director named Terrence Malick on a movie called A Hidden Life that came out in 2019. And he would say this thing, that music is meant to steal upon the subconscious. It's never supposed to force you to feel something. It's supposed to invite you into the narrative. And if there's a better thesis for, I think, ministry and life as ministers of the word, I don't know what is, because I think we are not meant to be emotionally coercive. We are meant to respect people's, I think, wills and sanctity enough to be able to simply, as artists and as preachers too. Preachers can do this too. With stories. And I think we're meant to have such a high view of the human being, that we, and a high view of God's work in the world, in and through us, and His desire to draw all people into Himself, that we don't have to press those buttons that we know are going to do X, Y, or Z. And the temptation of doing that is you want to get that reaction. You want to garner some kind of, maybe these days it's like clicks or shares or streams or whatever. I think it's more important than ever that we are not forcing people to feel things about the faith, that we're simply inviting people into. That doesn't mean we don't challenge. That doesn't mean we don't, like Jesus, he would say the kingdom of heaven is at hand. In other words, it's here. Come and take it. Come and take it. And then he would say things that were kind of challenging and jostling, but he would also say things that were a little bit obscure and confusing, that weren't so clear on the surface. Actually, it was with you that Andy Crouch said something I've never forgotten. He said, Jesus never answered a direct question except once. And he never, when somebody asked him a question, he never answered it directly. And that is not forcing people to feel things. That's inviting people into a story.
Jon, if you could expand on that just a little bit. Most of the folks who are listening or watching, some of them are songwriters, some of them are artists, but the majority of them are, stay-at-home parents or college students or software engineers or something, or baristas. The sort of starting point of prayer instead of performance, this relinquishing of the temptation to elicit particular reactions from others, especially online, in the digital age and otherwise. I don't know. What have you learned as a songwriter along those lines that might be helpful to us, have been helpful to you just as a human being living in a performative world? It's not just the musicians that feel the pressure to perform on a stage. Like in the digital age, especially, all of life is a stage. And we feel this incessant pressure to perform for everybody online. So talk about that. Like, talk to those of us who don't write music, don't create art in the classic sense. How might we sort of live into some of the things you're talking about?
I think the call of Christ at its root is to fear God and no one else. At its root, to fear God and no one else is to take up your cross and follow him, is to lay down your life for your friends. No greater love has been than this. It is to be a recipient of the overwhelming grace of God. And then the invitation is to live a life in the world, in the kingdom of God, though we are in this world. And I think the only way to do that I have found is prayer. And I think prayer, Abraham Joshua Heschel, his book on prayer is tremendous. He says prayer is an open door through which God and a person walk and meet there. He says prayer is this inner refuge where time is sanctified, not unlike the Sabbath. And I think for my only, antidote that I know of is to create this place inside yourself that is you and God, that continues to kind of grow and that is porous to the Spirit of God, where and is also subverting your own ego, is sifting your own thoughts, is really inviting God to take more and more command over your life and more space in your psyche, in your decision making. We can't serve God and fill in the blank. Jesus says you can't serve God and money. I don't think you can serve God and the praise of people either. You can't serve God and security at all costs. Whatever, fill in the blank, whatever the thing is for you. And prayer is, you can't fake it in prayer. It's hard. Silence is hard. There's music playing all the time. There's noise, there's traffic, there's whatever, the constant clatter of anxiety in your head, trying to figure things out. Good things, right? Trying to work, trying to think about your life, relationships. But prayer is a refuge from that. Prayer is the permission to say, I can take whatever is happening here and I can either put it aside, or if I can't put it aside because it's too loud, I can just bring it with me like this sack of burdens in prayer, and I can just lay it down. I don't have to figure it out. I actually don't. I can just lay it down before God, and that act over and over, like reps in the gym or something, does form your inner life in such a way that it makes the other things, and it makes the performance of living, which, yeah, we're all performing at some, if you're on social media, if you're having to do a job, whatever it is, you're always trying to kind of elicit reactions or trying to just live well in the world. Prayer is the antidote.
I want to give us a moment here to ponder and consider some of what Jon has already said, specifically as we consider whether you're a songwriter or an artist or not, whether you create work vocationally that is for public consumption or not. The day and age in which you and I live, most of us, and certainly the overwhelming majority of the people in our lives and the people we know and care about, live on a stage because of social media and the digital age, but also for a variety of other reasons. Achievement culture, the idolization of success, the deification of earning and having and being a particular type of person in the world. For all of these reasons and so much more, we live on a stage. And unless we are attentive and attuned to what the Spirit of God is doing in us and through us, we will default to living life as a performance. But what would it look like for us? What would it take for you to begin to relinquish the temptation and desire to perform, and instead to begin seeing your life as prayer? A prayer offered to God, and a prayer offered on behalf of others. I love what Jon said, that the call of Christ is to fear God and no one else. That the only way to live in this world as kingdom people is prayer, the Heschel idea, that prayer is an open door through which people walk to meet with God. So wherever you're listening to this, I want to invite you to take a moment. If it's safe to do so, maybe just begin to breathe slowly. If it is safe to do so, maybe close your eyes for a few moments and pray. Ask God by His Spirit to help you to fear Him. Not a cowering sort of fear because of you're afraid He's going to punish you if you do bad things, but fear in terms of awe and absolute wonder and gratitude that the God of the cosmos knows your name and loves you and cares for you and is with you. Ask Him to help you to also fear no one else, to live as a kingdom person through prayer. So take a moment, walk through that door, and meet with God, and then we'll continue in our conversation with Jon Guerra. I want to ask further about prayer. You said in a recent interview, you expanded on this beautiful quote from the poet, Christian Wyman, and you expanded on his quote and said, prayer is the ultimate articulation toward which all art is always tending. There's a lot there. It's a beautiful claim. Sort of explain what you mean by that. Prayer is the ultimate articulation toward which all art is always tending. And then, so explain that a bit. And then how does that conviction shape you as a songwriter and maybe even just the starting point of creating the art that you create?
That's such an insane quote, Wyman. Such a big fan of his. So human beings exist on two planes, right? We exist on the material and we exist on the spiritual. And the spiritual plane is as real as tables and chairs. And beauty puts us in contact with invisible things. And prayer puts us in contact with an invisible person. And so art and beauty is at its best, what it's doing, it's putting us in touch with a part of ourselves that is either laying dormant, that is either muted, that is just covered up by the cares and just by our very materialist world. And prayer is the invitation to take our life in the world and see through it and come into contact with the person. And when that happens over and over, we become deeper people. We become people that have layers. And that's really all, as a songwriter, that's really all I'm hoping for with my songs, is that the songs would do something in people, that they would become aware of this other part of themselves, and then hopefully listen through the songs and come into contact with hopefully God. I see my songs as prayer because I'm trying to put people in contact with the invisible person, not just the invisible world, invisible things, but at minimum, beauty and art puts us in contact with the invisible world. And that's what I take from his quote. Prayer is the ultimate articulation toward which art is always tending. It's contact.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm gonna be thinking about that for a while. Beauty and art puts us in touch with the invisible world. Prayer puts us in touch with an invisible person. It helps frame and actually make a lot of sense of much of what you've already said, which is that beauty and art and prayer all dance together. They all sort of do a very similar work in different ways, but a very similar work in us and through us, which is why coming back to music and the singing life of the church, music, I think in many ways, especially music in the church, probably needs to expand its horizons to take us into all of that which is invisible and all that which the invisible person, God himself, is able to hold, with us, not just our joy, but our pain and our grief. And so again, coming back to your music, it's one of the things I just so appreciate and love. It's so honest. And you venture into spaces of grief, like you just very directly venture into spaces of grief in many of your songs. And it strikes me the beauty in it is because the grief is sort of this necessary contrast for illuminating joy. So talk a little bit, if you can, not just in music, but just in life for our listeners, the important interplay between grief and joy. Because I mean, we live in a culture right now is like hedonic treadmill. We're just running after pleasure. We want to medicate
Right.
from anything that feels bad, but it's actually the stuff that kind of feels bad that leads us to great joy. So talk a bit about
Yep.
that and what you've learned in the sort of songwriting process.
I think the best story to answer that question is Jesus and the raising of Lazarus. Mary and Martha send a message and it says, Lord, the one you love is sick, which, side note, is one of the most beautiful prayers you can take for yourself. So just asking God, Lord, the one you love is sick. Pray that for a while and see what happens. It's pretty wild. Jesus comes then and he waits. He waits until Lazarus is dead. He comes. He has kind of a theological conversation with Martha about resurrection and the glory of God, because that's what she needed. And when he comes to Mary, he weeps because that's what she needed. And then he goes and he raises Lazarus from the dead. And everyone's astonished. And then that's the beginning, actually, of his movement towards the cross, because the religious leaders see this act and they're like, well, he's drawing people to himself. This has to stop. We either have to kill Lazarus or we have to kill him. But that story has everything. Jesus is weeping, and and he raises him from the dead. And that tells me that grief is part of resurrection, always. And if grief is part of resurrection for the Son of God, then it's certainly part of resurrection for us too.
On the album Jesus, which is this sort of stunning, it's stunning storytelling, the Christ narrative essentially set to music. One of the songs on the album is The Death of Lazarus, and it's instrumental. There are no lyrics. And I was just thinking about this as you're talking about what you're just talking about. And so I just want to ask you as a fan, really, What was your thought process with making that song instrumental, no lyrics, and almost like, there's a silence in it, even though it's this
Yeah.
beautiful song? Talk
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah. Sometimes there are no words. That's basically it. Sometimes we can't bring language to it. Sometimes all we have to do is weep. Jesus didn't say anything to Mary; he wept. And I think silence is a underused gesture in the Christian life for us as people working our way through it, and for us as ministers in inviting people how to interact with their lives in a godly way. I think silence is an underused resource because silence, it's an acknowledgement of your powerlessness. It's a surrender of your desire to control the situation. And it's implicitly a gesture of, I think, dependence upon God, who meets us in the silence and who does things in the silence that we could have never asked for. I wanted to make that song at least wordless, if not silent, to kind of gesture towards all of that.
Yeah, it's beautiful. You end the album, Jesus, with the song Jesus, and that song closes with these lyrics: make in me a heart pure enough to see you in every speck of dust, in dry and lonely places, and in every one of us. Be light, be kind, be gracious. And I wanted to read those lyrics for those listening and watching who aren't familiar with your music yet, because I assume that those words, as they were for me, are quite resonant. This beautiful longing are quite resonant for most people listening. So, Jon, as we close, considering these lyrics, like be light, be kind, be gracious, would you just give sort of a pastoral word of encouragement and blessing to our listeners who are going through just the grind and the madness and the chaos of their lives, like we are? Maybe a word of blessing and encouragement to remind them of the light, the kindness, and the grace of Christ that is in all of our ordinary, chaotic lives.
May we never forget the preciousness it is to be a human being. We are made in the image of God is a phrase that science, I think, has been for years and years and years giving us new flesh for. I mean, just what's happening inside our brains at all times, the possibilities of love and joy and living in a world, a sensory world that is, we have five senses to move through. I think we forget about the preciousness of every person. Like C.S. Lewis said, we forget that everybody at one point, everybody at any given time is moving towards an end, such that if we were to see it now, we'd be tempted to worship, or such that if we were to see it now, we would recoil in horror. That's because of the raw materials of who we are. We are finite and infinite at the same time. And the grace and love of Christ comes to awaken that preciousness in us and comes to awaken our sight so that we can recognize that preciousness in people. And I think that is the only way to go about living in a way that we're not burned out or exhausted, is by knowing that we're living in a world in which God is always more generous than we are. God did not come to the world to condemn the world, but that through Christ, all might be saved through him. That there is a love that is smiling through all things, that is reaching through all things towards every person, and even us, even us. And that, I think, is the great gift of Christianity, is the radical premise that despite all, we are loved, we are cherished, and we are headed towards reunion, towards recompense, towards light and love.
Yeah. Jon, thank you for those words. I love that thought. There is a love that is smiling and reaching toward all of us through all things. And thank you so much for this conversation, for your music. For those who are listening who are not yet familiar, they are familiar somewhat now. I would highly encourage going and checking out Jon's work. It's incredible. Thank you for your time and for your work and for your ministry and for this conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Jay.
Hey, everyone. I hope this conversation with Jon Guerra was inspiring and encouraging for you. And I would invite all of you, when you've got some time, give Jon's music a listen if you're unfamiliar with his work. I am confident it will create a space and a spaciousness for you to notice in a deep, meaningful way the loving presence of God and the story he's writing in you and through you and all around you. I want to leave you with this final benediction prayer of blessing, as we always do on the Digital Examen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, in this still moment, we pause to rest and relax into your presence. We thank you for the gift of this day, for the moments of light and levity, and all of your many graces, big and small. Help us to notice the goodness you weave in and through all things. Help us to reflect honestly on our missteps, to bring them to you humbly. We trust in your mercy, which is always healing, always restoring. Remind us of your nearness in our joy, our sorrow, and all our in-betweens. And as we look to tomorrow, grant us the courage to surrender our plans to your care. Fill us with a trust that is grounded in your goodness, and open our hearts wide to your love, that we may carry your grace into the world. Amen.